Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jerry Renaud. On this episode, Luke Beckman looks at corn and soybean markets. Chris Proctor talks about post-harvest weed control in winter wheat. Loren Giesler gives an update on soybean disease. And Governor Pete Ricketts discusses the Nebraska Livestock Friendly County program. Central Valley Ag ProEdge grain sales manager Luke Beckman is our market analyst this week. According to the latest USDA crop progress report, both corn and soybeans, good to excellent conditions, declined just slightly last week. Corn was down 1 point to 71%, but it's still the third highest rating of the past 5 years. Soybeans slipped 3%, with 67% now in good to excellent condition. That's also the third highest rating in the past 5 years. The report shows 57% of corn was in the dough stage. That's 20% ahead of the 5-year average of 37%. Soybeans are 92% blooming, and that's 6 percentage points ahead of the average. The report also shows 90% of winter wheat harvested. We talked with Luke Wednesday morning about a number of things impacting corn and soybeans, but began by asking for his analysis of the latest crop progress report.
Well, I think, Jerry, with the crop ratings that came out on Monday, I mean, corn was down a point, beans down a little bit more than what they thought. I think the big thing the market's really looking at is the crop report that, would have aired on Friday before we had the opportunity, or shot this before we had the opportunity to see those. But crop ratings in general, I think, will set the tone for what the yields are going to say, in the Friday numbers. And that is that the corn crop looks great. Bean crops starting to tail off a little bit, but for the most part, these crops have been in good shape nationally, since they've been in the ground.
And the WASDE report will give us a little better indication on yield.
Yes, as we go forward, every crop report that we see really gets us one step further down the path of price discovery. And we've been using a trend-adjusted yield model up to this point. The August report's going to incorporate some objective data. The September report gets a little bit better. As that information becomes more clear, they get in the field, they start getting ear weights incorporated. You also have the private industry that's going to engage in crop tours. That happens in August as well. So we're a few weeks away from continuing to incorporate better information to give us a better picture of price discovery going forward.
Okay, let's talk about probably the key issue that seems to be having some impact these days, and that is the trade issues. That's affecting a lot of different things, and it's really speculative at this point.
It is. Nobody knows what the next move is going to be in the trade discussions, so it's a little bit fruitless to speculate what it might be. But what we do know is that it is a little bit of a black cloud hanging over this market. And really, Jerry, as we look at what the immediate impact is to farmers, one of them that's coming down the pike pretty shortly is going to be harvest soybeans. Now, it's been well documented that the Chinese are buying Brazilian soybeans at a premium to U.S. values, mostly out of principle probably. But what it's going to do to the U.S. farmer is it's making it very difficult for grain companies to sell any October business, to push soybeans out the door kind of in that October-November period. And so if producers are watching their local grain bids for harvest delivery soybeans, they're probably noticing that harvest soybean basis is weaker than they're typically used to seeing. We would need to see something resolved in pretty short order here to allow the U.S. to start pushing business out the door in October. It does not appear at this point in time that that's going to happen. And so a weaker harvest soybean basis is a reality that we're probably going to experience this year. It has a lot to do with grain companies across the U.S. are going to be forced to store their soybeans when typically they're shoving those out the door in October and November. So weaker soybean basis values for producers off the combine. And if you have soybeans sitting in an elevator that are plugging things up, you have less room to operate and handle corn. So really, if you're a farmer that has to move grain out of the field, you might start to look at basis values, locking in basis values for grain that you have to move out of the field.
And what is this going to do as we look into the future of 2019? Is that going to have some impact if this is still hanging over our heads?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of things swirling right now, and soybeans really, and the trade issues certainly create some interesting dynamics as we look ahead. But you know, we've really been proposing this question to farmers. As you start to look at 2019, if the trade issues in beans are not resolved, and even if they aren't, you know, even if they are, excuse me, the balance sheet really isn't that friendly for soybeans, especially if we have, you know, a big yield. What is the U.S. farmer going to do if November 2019 soybeans are $8 off the combine and corn is penciling at $3.50 or $3.75? What does the U.S. farmer do? We would certainly speculate that the farmer is going to take and put an acre of soybeans into wheat. With what's going on in the wheat market, that certainly looks like a viable option. They're going to take soybeans and put those acres into corn. That looks like a viable option. So you're going to have acres shift away from beans and into other row crops, commodities. And as we talk to producers about that, we really say, is there an opportunity to start marketing your 2019 corn if we expect that corn acres are going to start to go up next year? Certainly very early to talk about that, but as you look at the trade issues in beans and we look further down the trail, it really looks like we have an opportunity to maybe lock in some attractive corn prices for 2019 while futures are trading above $4.
And if this all sort of comes to pass, what does that do? I mean, what's the impact?
Well, I think just that exactly. I mean, I think that, you know, farmers can only take the guarantee today. And another question we've probably asked our farmers is, over the past 4 years, what % of your corn crop have you marketed over $4.10 December futures? And that's not to be demeaning in any way, but it really highlights the opportunity that's on the table today to maybe lock in some of those attractive prices if we speculate that the soybean market is going to be in a little bit of trouble longer term. The trade deal is going to take longer to figure out than maybe what we originally planned. And if that's the case, we go from 90 million acres of soybeans this year, a 10% correction takes them down to the low 80s, maybe pushes corn acres up into the mid 90s. That's not a fundamentally constructive conversation in corn, despite the fact that the balance sheet for corn does continue to look better with a tighter carryout.
Next week, Doug Simon from Trados will join us to discuss the August WASDE report. Delayed planting and cool spring conditions left many winter wheat fields less competitive with weeds in 2018. Fields not treated with herbicides during the growing season now have substantial weed problems that will need to be managed. We spoke with Chris Proctor, Nebraska Weed Management Extension Educator, and asked him why fall weed control and timing is so important in harvested wheat fields.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I think it's real important to pay attention to weed control following winter wheat harvest is if those weeds aren't managed, one, they're growing, and so they're going to use moisture, and so if moisture is an issue, you're just taking moisture out of your profile that you're going to need for that subsequent crop. So I think that's one of the issues that stands out. Another one to pay attention to is if those weeds are just left to go until you get to that next crop, a lot of them are going to go to seed, and so then you're going to end up with quite a bit of seed in your seed bank, and then you're going to have more weeds that are going to come up when you hit that next crop. When you think about timing of these herbicide applications following wheat, kind of the recommendation is being that 20 to 30 day window for that initial application following winter wheat harvest. So you don't want to get too much past that 30-day mark before you spray something, because that gives you a chance to get the weeds while they're still small. So I think it's something to pay attention to, is weed size is really critical when you're managing these. In a lot of situations, using a split application makes a lot of sense, and so that's where you would come that 20 to 30 days and you'd apply your initial application to control the weeds that are up. But there's a number of weeds that may not come up till later in the season, so volunteer wheat would be one, some of the winter annual grasses, and so coming back, you know, as you get into early to mid-September with that second application as a way to manage those later emerging weeds can be really effective, especially those winter annual grass weeds, just because that's the best time to control them, and if you miss them, then they become more challenging. Yeah, so some things you can do, I think, to help yourself out. One, making sure you have really good wheat residue. So the wheat residue does a great job of managing the weeds, and so keeping that residue, not baling it off, is one way you can help suppress weeds. Making sure you have a good spreader chopper on the back of your combine to make sure that residue is evenly distributed helps quite a bit. If that residue tends to pile up, you're not going to get as good of even control. or a lot of the weed seeds will kind of pile up in that residue, and when you go to spray over top, you're just not going to get as good a control in that situation either. Yeah, so paying attention to what products you're using, knowing what you'd like to go to that next year. So it's pretty common to use Roundup and atrazine, or gramoxone and atrazine as a way to manage your weeds. But if you're using atrazine in that system following wheat, well, that's going to limit you to corn the next year. So if you want to go to soybeans, you need to think about something different you can use in place of atrazine because of the carryover effect. And so just paying attention to that. Yeah, a couple of things that you could think about in terms of takeaway. The guide for weed disease and insect management is a really helpful guide. There's a section on eco-fallow farming that covers a lot of these topics, and so there's some good information there. There's a recent Crop Watch article that came out looking at weed control following winter wheat. But again, it's just paying attention to timely application of herbicides, one, to preserve your soil moisture, two, to reduce that weed seed bank potential in that subsequent crop. And thinking about what crop am I rotating to, so I'm making sure I'm selecting the right herbicides based on that. And relying on some of the cultural things you can do, like good wheat residue as a way to suppress weeds in addition to using some herbicides.
To purchase the 2018 Weed Management Guide, go to marketplace.unl.edu or visit the Market Journal website at marketjournal.unl.edu. Scouting soybean fields in early August is important to help identify potential disease issues. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Loren Giesler says soybean seedling infections that happen early in the growing season are now showing up in the crop. We met with Loren in the field to learn more about these infections as well as how to identify and manage them.
Well, anytime we have really wet conditions early on, that provides a great opportunity for a lot of infection early. And some of our diseases, for example, SDS, even some of the Fusarium wilt pathogens, and others can have a latency period. And charcoal rot is a good one, for example, where early on we have wet conditions, we get some infection, and then later in the season we see that progress to what we see in that pod filling stages. So early wet conditions are really conducive for diseases, not only seedling diseases early on that affect stand, but then later in the season that we'll see. So after those wet conditions in the spring, once we have really hot conditions or dry conditions, that's really a perfect situation for charcoal rot. So any parts of the state where they were wet and then later in the season they were dry, we were seeing some charcoal rot even earlier this year. And then now we'll see that continuing to progress. The other thing that stress can do is with that heat stress, if it's dry, that stresses the plants. So then if we get a situation that right after that drought or that stress of heat, we get a heavy rain event, that's where we've seen some pretty significant Phytophthora this year. So all the points that can really stress the plant in any way, if it's stress, if it's a high availability of moisture or flooding early on, really provide courts for infection, and then we'll see that show up. Right now we're in that stem and root rot phase of soybean development. So this is when we see all the things that are, from Phytophthora to sudden death syndrome to charcoal rot, brown stem rot. Now, all these will be showing up now. So critical time now to really scout those fields, because those are all also diseases that we're going to use resistance for in future years if we identify them. You can't really do anything now, but you can scout and identify and use the right resistance in the future. Yeah, so a couple things. When we're looking at stem and root rots, it is important to identify it correctly. So the biggest thing is when you pull those plants up, if it's sudden death syndrome, it's going to pull real easy. That taproot's going to be rotted off. And comparing that to brown stem rot, we really need to take that plant and split the stem to see where that discoloration is. If it's brown stem rot, there's going to be dark discoloration in the center. If it's sudden death syndrome, that discoloration is going to be in those outer layers directly under the tissues on the outside. There'll just be some streaking underneath there. So you won't see anything evident on the outside, but inside you'll see that discoloration, not in the center. If you see discoloration on the outside, there's a couple things that could be. You could have Phytophthora, root and stem rot if it's going from the soil base working its way up. If you see breaks in that discoloration and green streaks, you're probably dealing with stem canker, and we are seeing more stem canker this year. The other thing to look for right now is frog eye leaf spot. So many producers have already made their decision and sprayed if they were going to, but that's another one to watch for, because that's something that you can use resistance for in future years. Not that you're necessarily going to spray as we get into these reproductive stages. I'd really recommend that R3 or early R4 application timing. But at this point, you can really be out there scouting to know, hey, do I have something that's going to show up in residue in the following years? Really, from the disease management standpoint right now, it's really more of watch and keep records. So identifying the things that you see in your fields, identifying how much of that field is affected. Just for example, sudden death syndrome. If you're having significant effects of that and you see, half of your field or significant amount of that field affected, maybe the next time you're in that field with soybeans, you're going to make that decision to use that additional seed treatment. But keeping records and knowing how much is really being impacted is going to be critical for future production and really to make profitable decisions.
For more information on soybean diseases and proper identification, you can visit the UNL crop production website at cropwatch.unl.edu. Nebraska is rich with water, and according to John Winkler, General Manager at the Papio, Missouri River Natural Resources District, water is the new oil. The NRD is involved in building and maintaining river levees, protecting crucial national security assets like the Offutt Air Force Base near Omaha. That's why Winkler was appointed to attend the National Security Forum at the Air War College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Sitting at the table with military personnel and security policymakers opened Winkler's eyes on the value of each drop of water. It also made him think about where Nebraska fits into the global picture. Read about Winkler's takeaways from this experience in the August Nebraska Farmer. Livestock production is the largest sector of agriculture in Nebraska, and improving the livestock industry will help grow our economy. The Nebraska Livestock Friendly County program recognizes counties that actively support the livestock industry. We spoke with Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts earlier this week at the state capitol and asked him about the importance of livestock in Nebraska's economy.
Livestock is part of our agricultural industry, and agriculture is the heart and soul of what we do in here in Nebraska. It drives our economy. 1 in 4 jobs in Nebraska is tied back to agriculture. And if you look at the over 20% it makes up of our state economy, about half of that is related to livestock. And so one of the ways that we can grow agriculture is by growing livestock here in our state.
And one of the ways that we are trying to do that is by creating counties that are livestock friendly. Tell us a little bit about that program.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Livestock Friendly Program is a designation that the state gives to counties when they go back and take a look at their regulations, work with the state to get that designation, basically see what can they do to make sure that they're being welcoming to those businesses, and frankly also setting the rules for the people in that county so they know what will happen if a livestock operator comes to their county. So at the end of the day, what it really says is that the county commissioners and the zoning people have all gotten together to say, hey, we're open for business. We want to see more livestock operations in our county because we know that helps us create jobs in our county.
And it's important for producers as well.
Yeah, because one of the things that any business wants, and especially livestock producers, is they want that certainty. And again, when you establish those ground rules, what it says is the county is business friendly and open for business. Those livestock operators can come in and get established and again start creating the jobs that then help support the local economy, property taxes, schools, roads. And it's not just the jobs on the livestock operation, it's also the jobs that are related to agriculture, whether you're talking about somebody who's going to be the seed salesman or the implement dealer or the bank examiner or whoever it would be, the loan officer. All those jobs are going to be tied back to agriculture. So by growing that fundamental core of agriculture and especially livestock, what that allows us to do is create other jobs that then make sure that we have those great opportunities for our young people to stay in our counties.
Now we're doing a pretty good job here. We're up to 50%. I think Polk County is the latest one to create this designation. But 50%, how important is that to the state?
Yeah, Polk County was the one that pushed us over the edge to get to 50%, and that is fantastic for the state of Nebraska. That shows again that the counties are getting on board with these programs and are putting the rules in place so that they're welcoming to those livestock operations, and that's absolutely critical for us as a state. What we have to do to grow agriculture is focus on value-added agriculture, and livestock is our best opportunity to do that. To take the row crops we grow, the hay, the dried distillers grain, and be able to feed it to livestock here in our state rather than shipping it out of state adds value to it and creates more economic prosperity for us. And so by making sure that we're livestock friendly, we're helping grow value-added agriculture that really, again, ripples through our entire economy.
You talked a little bit about this earlier, but let's really reiterate the value of livestock producing in Nebraska.
Yeah, so if you look at all of our overall ag receipts, livestock makes up about half of it. And we are a huge exporter of, for example, beef. We're the largest beef exporting state in the country, over $1.2 billion. Last year, our beef exports to Japan, for example, grew by 26%. But that's not alone. Our pork exports grew by 46%. So what we want to do is make sure we have more opportunities to be able to grow those export markets, because about 95% of the world's consumers lie outside our borders. And livestock, that protein, is going to be in huge demand in a world that is increasingly looking for that. It's a huge opportunity for us. And again, that livestock-friendly designation helps make sure we've got the counties in place that can welcome those livestock operations and be able to create those great paying jobs. And it's also great from the standpoint of when you bring in those operations, it helps not only create those direct jobs, but allows that livestock, or our farmers and ranchers, to be able to diversify the revenue stream, allows them to bring young people in and build equity, all things that strengthen our ag economy.
Now, one of the things that it seems like this is saying is Nebraska is open for business. Is this working?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, I mentioned how our exports are growing. So we're really developing that reputation worldwide for our high-quality products. We can also see it when I was in Japan last year. We went to a restaurant that has since rebranded itself with the Nebraska name because of our high-quality beef. We see it in companies like Costco when they chose to locate their poultry processing facility in Fremont. They did that because they know that we're a great place for them to be able to grow. Not only are they going to be creating those 800 jobs in Fremont, but the opportunity for about 125 farmers to put up poultry barns, which will again help them to build that equity, bring young people back, all those great things that go along with growing value-added agriculture. And again, I think what they see is the great opportunity here in Nebraska to be able to do that.
And we've had some struggles in the industry in recent years. Things are looking good right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, if you look at what we're doing, we're growing our beef industry, we're adding on to our swine herd. I think we're a great opportunity for people in poultry. We mentioned Costco already, but you've got Hendricks Genetics, which has opened up a chick hatchery in Grand Island, one for turkeys down in Beatrice. So I think you're seeing that people are seeing us not only for beef and pork, but looking at other areas of livestock that they grow, like poultry, and that we're a great place to do that because we've got that great accessibility to water, especially with the Ogallala Aquifer. That's helped us, for example, become the #1 state for cattle on feed. But it also means that we've got the great opportunity to irrigate. We're the largest irrigated state in the country. That creates certainty around that feed source. And that's something that is attractive to people as well. When you can bring in that corn and those soybeans, it really helps make that operator know that they're going to have access to that high quality feed. And of course, if you look at that Costco plant, they are going to use about 360,000 bushels of corn every week and about 3,000 metric tons of soybean meal. That's equivalent of about 2,000 acres of corn and 2,000 acres of soybeans every week. That's going to be a tremendous benefit to those local farmers and helping out with their basis. Huge deal. It's a win-win.
For more information and to see a map of livestock-friendly counties, you can visit the Nebraska Department of Agriculture's website at nda.nebraska.gov. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, the major precipitation that was recorded throughout the state was basically concentrated in southwest, south central Nebraska up through central Nebraska, primarily in that Tuesday to Wednesday time frame. And the heaviest concentration of precipitation was generally between York and Kearney and just to the north of Grand Island and south of Grand Island. As you got close to the Kansas border, unfortunately, precipitation totals were not so generous. Now, we do have the data for the month of July on the nation basically summarized, and it kind of gives us perspective of what we might be dealing with as we go forward in time. So let's take a look quickly at a recap of July. And in terms of temperatures, you can see some of the cooler temperatures that invaded Nebraska. Most of this occurred during the last 14 to 15 days of the month. So we were well above normal the first half, well below normal the second half in terms of precipitation. We do show some above normal precipitation in some areas of the state, and we also see some drying trends, and that does look like it's expanded even farther to the east. So our conditions this month are going to be very critical, especially with the bean fill that is currently ongoing. So if we look at the upper air models, really not a lot to talk about. We got this high pressure system in place, and it's going to be the primary factor for our weather for this entire weekend as the upper air trough in the west slowly makes its way eastward. So we have surface high pressure in place. We're going to see some very nice conditions this weekend, and if you like the warmth and no precipitation, Nebraska is the place to be. We'll see temperatures in the upper 80s to low 90s statewide, and then by tomorrow we'll see that ridge slowly starting to drift toward the east. The surface high pressures move a little bit more toward the east-southeast, and that may allow some late-day moisture to start making its way up into our region, but it may be intercepted by a wave moving down through Texas. Heavy precipitation expected in this region. And then as we get into Monday, that high-pressure system once again begins to slide a little bit farther toward the east. High pressure is firmly in control. We do show a little surface low up to our north, and that's going to be associated with that wave trying to move across the northern plains, but it's moisture-starved. Main ingredients for precipitation still remain down in Texas. Now on Tuesday, we start to see the ridge trying to break down, shows a little bit of a messy, wavy pattern moving across our region. High pressure still in control, but on the return moisture of this high pressure, we may see some of these low pressure systems acting on some of that moisture, particularly in western Nebraska, get some elevated convection developing. And then as we go on the day on Wednesday, we see that messy upper air pattern start to slide toward the Great Lakes. High pressure still firmly in control. There are signs that we may see some scattered convection across the central United States. The best area is southeast Nebraska, and even now I'm not very confident simply because we don't have a lot of moisture to work with at the surface, and then the ridge starts to rebuild back in on Thursday. We do show surface lows along the high plains region, both in the Dakotas and to our southwest and southwestern Kansas. But most of the moisture remains with the troughing pattern over the eastern Corn Belt with just a little bit of light returns in the western part of the state. Then we set up a weak northwest flow, a little cooler conditions in the northeast with a surface low in the eastern Dakotas. It'll be sliding toward the Great Lakes. That might get a little northwest flow going and get some precipitation, particularly in eastern Nebraska, generated during the prime heating hours of the day. But most of the remainder of the state remains dry. 8 to 14 day forecast continues to heat across the northern plains from next Thursday to the following Tuesday. And in terms of precipitation, a drier trend reestablishes itself.
Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, post-harvest weed control in winter wheat, soybean disease, and the Nebraska Livestock-Friendly County Program. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Doug Simon from Trados will join us to look at the August WASDE report. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jerry Renaud, and we'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.